Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Here to welcome you into episode number 151. Today we're going to be taking a quick look at another one of my favorite records from the 1990s. The album in question is entitled Charm of the Highway Strip by the band. The band are the immortal Magnetic Fields. Now, the Magnetic Fields formed in Boston. Back in 1989, the band released its first album, Distant Plastic Trees, in 1991. In 1992, the band released their sophomore effort, The Wayward Bus. In April of 1994, the band released its third and what is, in my opinion, their finest album, Charm of the Highway Strip. Now, later that same year, in September of 1994, the band released their fourth album, Holiday. Now, I've always wondered this. In terms of the Magnetic Fields and their very prolific 1994, how is it even possible for one band to release two albums of such high quality, basically just 6 months apart from one another? I do believe that the truth lies in something I read once, which stated that originally the band had recorded the album Holiday before they recorded Charm of the Highway Strip, but unfortunately, at a certain point in time, Holiday fell victim to bureaucratic red tape when the band and their label entered into some sort of a legal tussle. Therefore, the band decided to release their fourth album third, that being the legendary Charm of the Highway Strip. Now, unless I'm misremembering, I do believe that I first got turned on to the music of the Magnetic Fields back in either 2005 or 2006, which means that despite the fact that I've been a fan of this band for at least 20 years, yes, I am able to admit that I was relatively tardy to the party, but you know, I always think of these things the same way I would think of a woman's period. You know, it's better late than never. And by the time I finally did get turned on to this band, I did get turned on to them in the best way when possible. That is by seeing them live. Now, back in the early 2000s, I had two friends that I considered to be sort of my show buddies. One of them in particular was somebody that I met through work as a client, and he was somebody that I very much enjoyed talking to. We would have these epic geek out sessions. He and I had similar tastes in music. So, you know, at a certain point in time, we decided to take our relationship to the next level. And we began hanging out outside of work. And it really was going to shows together that became our pastime. In fact, in the early 2000s, I would say that some of the best shows I saw during that era were with him. I remember that we went to go see Band of Horses, a band that I don't think I'd ever heard up until the time I saw them live. We also saw Fleet Foxes. Coincidentally, I think the first time I ever heard the Fleet Foxes was by seeing them live as well. Now, my favorite show that he and I ever went to together was by an artist that he and I really bonded over. It was the second time that I was fortunate enough to see this artist. I do believe for my friend it was his one and only time seeing the immortal Daniel Johnston. Still to this day, one of the greatest shows that I've ever seen in my entire life. All three of those shows, if I'm not mistaken, actually, were at a venue in Seattle called Numos, which at the time was one of my favorite venues in the city. But when he called me one day out of the blue and asked if I would be interested in going to see this band with him called the Magnetic Fields, I remember that this was a band that I may have been familiar with by name, but a band that at the time I had never heard. But based on the fact that he and I shared a lot of commonalities in our music tastes and the fact that he had never really steered me in the wrong direction, I was very eager to go see this band live, not to mention the fact that the show, I believe, was at the Moore Theater, which was always one of my favorite venues in Seattle. Now, keep in mind, Seattle is a city that is just drenched in amazing music venues, but for some reason, the Moore Theater has always been one of my favorites. So he and I got downtown, we got into the theater. Now, I don't remember specifically if there wasn't an opening band, or for some reason we had missed the opening band, but I remember We got into the theater and we found our seats, and I looked down at the stage, and I was sort of hit with this immediate feeling of dread because, placed in certain positions across the stage were chairs and music stands. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, this is going to be some pretentious Ivy League horse hockey right here. So I looked over at my friend and I said to him, can you explain to me this band? Because I got to tell you, looking at the stage, this does not seem very promising. Now, what he said in response was, he said, yeah, look, I get it. This is not a good look, but trust me, this is a band that you will love. This is something that you've never seen or heard before, and I guarantee that by the time we leave this theater tonight, you will consider yourself a fan of the Magnetic Fields. Now, eventually the band came out on stage, and they plopped themselves in their various positions on the stage, at which point in time, I metaphorically crossed my arms in defiance. I thought to myself, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to be won over by this pomposity. But that attitude was quickly melted away from me once the band began playing, and I realized that my friend was once again correct. Not only had I never heard or seen anything like this, but it did not take very long before I began to warm up to this band. And wouldn't you just know it? By the time the show ended and we were walking out of the theater, I was considering myself to be a somewhat casual Magnetic Fields fan, despite the fact that I'd never once heard any of their albums. So the very next day, I ran out to one of my local record stores where I remedied that situation. Unless I'm mistaken, I do believe that the first record of theirs I ever purchased was the album Holiday. I do believe I bought that album on CD at the time. I remember I took it home, and that was not a slow burn for me. That was an album that immediately leaped out of the speakers, landed on my face, and began to squirm. So in relatively short order, I went out and I purchased, if not all, I would say most of the albums that the band had released up until that point in time. Now, I don't exactly remember when it was in the chronology that I stumbled upon this record, Charm of the Highway Strip, but from the first time I listened to it on, I can tell you that this has pretty much always been my favorite record in the band's canon. As I mentioned before, this record was released on April 18th, 1994. It was produced by the band's frontman, Stephen Merritt. I do believe that this was the first album that the band released on Merge Records. Now, this is a record that I've often heard described as space-age country music. Now, I don't know that I could necessarily agree with that or vouch for that, as a matter of fact, but what this record is, in my opinion, is simply one of the greatest indie pop records ever recorded. I've also heard this record described as being a bit of a concept album because there is one theme that sort of ties all of the songs on this record together, that being travel. To me, I've always said to people that this record to me sounds like a cross-country road trip, which is something that I am very passionate about. It's something I've done on many different occasions. I've lived in 8 different states across the country, and my wife and I, we always sort of think it's interesting that of all the places that we've traveled and lived around the United States, that we ended up settling in Nashville because despite the fact that Nashville is a very nice place to live, it is clean, it is safe, it has treated my wife and I very well professionally. We have amazing music venues, we have great record stores. In a lot of ways, I would say of all the places we've lived, it is the least us because, it can be a little bit bland, and I've heard people who like it less than I do say that it is a cultural void. Now, I don't know that I would necessarily go that far, but I can assure you that this is a place that, is definitely run by the maggots and the Bible thumpers. And, although that's sort of changing slowly, the more people move here, it is sort of rooted in the Bible Belt. It is very much God, Trump, and football. And that's one of the things that was the biggest culture shock to both my wife and I moving out here from California was not necessarily the Bible thumpers and the maggots, but the college football thing. It's something out here that is just hard for me to wrap my mind around as somebody that does not understand the great sport of football and its appeal. You definitely realize out here how quickly that makes you an outcast. I remember One of the first conversations I had with a client when I moved out here to Tennessee, he was telling me that he was a Tennessee fan and that his wife was an Alabama fan. And he's like, you can only imagine what Saturdays are like at my house. I said, actually, I really can't. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't want any part of this nonsensical horse hockey, son. In Nashville, people at the age of 18, they decide which college they are going to go to. And from that point forward, it basically defines who you are throughout the course of your life. It is nothing to see a man that is my age or older out there in public wearing all of the swag of the college that he attended 30 years ago, referring to the college football team as us and we. That is something that I've still never gotten used to. But yes, Nashville is at the end of the day a nice place to live, but there are things about it that are a little bit un-us when it comes to my wife and I. There are certainly places I feel as if we fit in better. Not that her and I really fit in anywhere. We're a couple of weirdos, to be perfectly honest with you. But, one of the things I always associate with this album, probably the biggest association that I have with this album in terms of my personal experience with this album and this band, generally speaking, is I was very much into this band. Now, I first discovered this band back in 2005 or 6, as I mentioned before. And right around the time I met my wife, which was in early 2013, I would say that my fandom of the Magnetic Fields was at its absolute peak. At that point in time, this was a band that I would have easily considered to be in my top 5 favorite bands of all time. And this was a band that, despite the fact that my wife and I don't necessarily agree when it comes to music and pop culture very often, this was a band that her and I both liked. It wasn't necessarily the first band that we bonded over, which was Placebo, either Placebo or Depeche Mode. I think it was one of those two that we first bonded over. This was a band that her and I also bonded over, and what it makes me think of the most in terms of my early relationship with my wife and the fact that I was so ensconced in such a deep Magnetic Fields phase at that point in time was there was a place that her and I used to go when we first started dating. Now, I met my wife living in Santa Cruz, California, which is my favorite place in the world. People always ask me, if money were no object, where would you live? I tell people every day it would be Santa Cruz, California. My wife was fortunate enough to go to high school in Santa Cruz, California, so I feel like she takes it a little bit more for granted than I do. But I had an opportunity to live in Santa Cruz for about a year and a half. That was easily my favorite place I've ever lived. My favorite place in the entire world that I've been, anyway. And her and I first started dating when I lived in Santa Cruz. And after work, her and I met working together. And after work, when her and I were still brand new, we used to go to this little dive bar in Santa Cruz, California. In fact, it was not really a dive bar as much as it was a redneck bar. People always have a tendency to laugh, especially people out here in Tennessee. When you tell people that there are rednecks in California, people think it is an impossibility. I can assure you, especially based on where I grew up, there are rednecks in California, son. Okay, actually, most of the state is rednecks. If you think that California, I always tell this to people out here in Tennessee, people who think that they hate Californians because they are super conservative. I always tell people, if you think you hate California because it's all liberal, I mean, you are executing an innocent man, because most of the state geographically is actually hyper-conservative. Dare I say, borderline redneck. Where I grew up, it was redneck, son, straight up. And even in Santa Cruz, a place that I think of as being pretty progressive, you can certainly find pockets of redneck activity. And my wife and I, we used to frequent this bar in Aptos. It was called the Windjammer. Now, I'm mentioning it by name out of, absolute affection, because it was a place that I love, not to mention the fact that I think it has gone tits up. I think it was a victim of COVID, so it's no longer there. But we used to go to this place almost every day, not every day, but let's say 3 or 4 times a week, called the Windjammer. And it was sort of a redneck bar, and my wife and I were very new at the time, and I guess we were guilty at times of PDA, and when we would walk in there, people used to laughingly refer to us as the makeout couple, when it was a place that I felt most of the people were pretty friendly for the most part. And it was kind of one of those places that I guess once the regulars get to know you, you're sort of, begrudgingly accepted into the club. And like any other dive bar, There was a jukebox, and the jukebox was something that my wife and I used to just make our stomachs turn, because the people that frequented this place literally had the worst taste in music that I've ever heard in my entire life. I mean, if it wasn't shitty new country music, it was things like Stevie Ray Vaughan and the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix, just all this crappy vanilla blues. Yes, I said that the Rolling Stones, and yes, I said that Jimi Hendrix are crappy. I do apologize. Leave it in the comment section. I don't want to hear any of your garbage in rebuttal, okay? I don't. It's just stuff I don't like. And I remember there was one guy specifically who would go up there with a $20 bill, and he would just monopolize the jukebox, and it was always just the most heinous garbage that I had ever heard. Now, at this point in time, I was very much into the Magnetic Fields. Like I said, they were probably one of my top 5 favorite bands of all time. So what I would do as a rebuttal is I would go up there and I would purposely play songs off of the Magnetic Fields 69 Love Songs, which was the only album that they had on this redneck jukebox. And actually, to be honest with you, I was stunned to find out that they had any Magnetic Fields on this redneck jukebox. And I remember specifically the song that my wife and I would play on the jukebox over and over and over again was Papa Was a Rodeo, which is still one of my favorite Magnetic Fields songs of all time. But I remember we would put that song on over and over again, and every time that song would start, you would hear people groan from across the room, and inevitably all of the smokers would stream out of the place because they knew that they were in for 4 minutes of non-Bruce Springsteen, non-Stevie Ray Vaughan, non-Georgia Satellites, real music, good music. Do you understand what I'm saying? And it sort of became this joke with my wife and I that every time we went there, we would play a little bit of the Magnetic Fields. Now, when my wife and I moved up to Oakland, not long after that, we moved back up to Oakland, there was an opportunity. My wife and I had to see the Magnetic Fields one night at the Fox Theater, and I remember I bought tickets at a certain point in time, but her and I decided at the last second, I don't know why it was, we decided not to go. So unfortunately, I've only seen the band live once, back in 2005 or 2006. It is a band now at this point in time, of course. I would love to go back and see live again. I don't really know at this point in time how active they are in terms of playing live or touring, but this is a band that I have kept up with throughout the course of most of their career. They have a lot of stuff that I absolutely really love. As I mentioned before, this is probably my favorite record of theirs. I think that it pretty much always has been. As I said before, to me, this song this record, it sounds like a cross-country road trip. Traveling and driving cross-country is something that I'm very passionate about. In fact, this is one of my favorite records to listen to while I'm in the car, while I am driving cross-country. And to me, this album, I mean, it does not have a single bad song on this entire record. In fact, I would go as far as to say that I think you'd be hard-pressed really to find a single bad second on this album. Now, as far as some of my favorites go, which at the end of the day, you know, I think that all of the songs off of this record are favorites of mine. I love the opening track. I love Lonely Highway. I love Long Vermont Roads. I love the instrumental track on Long Vermont Roads. It is still, to this day, is one of the most unique songs that I've ever heard instrumentally. If I had to pick a favorite song on this record, the third one would be one of them, Born on a Train. Oh my God, I absolutely love this song. I mean, this record illustrates basically what you can find throughout the course of the entire Magnetic Fields catalog. That being that, in my opinion, Stephen Merritt is one of the greatest singers and songwriters in the history of pop music. I love the way he uses the language. I love the way he sees the world. Now, I realize on these videos, oftentimes I can come across as being an inarticulate ass, and I'm not here to deny that, but I will tell you that it is ironic in a sense, because I am actually a very avid reader, and I can tell you that one of the things that attracts me to people's writing, whether it is in music or whether it is in literature, is having an interesting, not only having a command of the language, but having an interesting way of using the language. I am a person that is just madly in love with the English language, and I'm always drawn to writers that put their own spin on it, and that is something that Stephen Merritt is just absolutely gifted at. Not only does he use an interesting turn of phrase and verbiage and the way that he views the world, but his actual you see, I'm an inarticulate ass. I just mentioned this a second ago, but his writing is something that I think is among the greatest in the history of rock and roll. I mean, I think that he is in absolutely, elite company. Now, keep in mind, I don't necessarily think that he is up there with my good friend Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey, but he is somebody that I definitely think belongs in the conversation. And lyrically, this album, in my opinion, is his greatest work, especially on songs like Born on a Train, which to me is one of the greatest pop songs of all time. I love the song I Have the Moon. If I had to pick a favorite song off this record, it would either be Born on a Train or this song, Two Characters in Search of a Country Song. I love the lyric that starts off the song where he says, "You were just like me. You were one big bruise in the game of life. We were playing to lose." This is a song that always makes me think of my wife and our travels. I have this sort of habit of making these little playlists for my wife, these little lovey-dovey things that I make on Spotify or other streaming services, and her and I will sometimes listen to them in the car, and every single playlist I've ever made for her ever features the song Two Characters in Search of a Country Song, because that song to me represents us. It represents our relationship. I love that song. I love the song Crowded Drifters. Oh my God. Another one of the best songs on this album is The Fear of Trains. Man, the story in that song, the character that he writes in that song is somebody that just makes your heart bleed. I love the lyrics to that song. Again, one of my favorite songwriters of all time. When you hear a Stephen Merritt song lyrically, you know it's him. I think that's one of the coolest things about him as a writer is not only his use of the language and the way he sees the world, but he just has a voice that as soon as you hear it, you know that it's him. I love the song Sunset City. I love the song Dust Bowl. I mean, if there's one, and this is a very loose term, but if there's one weakest song on this album to me, which is not a skipper, there's not one skipper on this entire album, but if there is one song that I would say is probably my weakest, it would be when the open road is closing in, which I like. It's not a bad song. I do like it. But if this is a record you are unfamiliar with, I highly recommend that you go out and check this record out. If for some reason this is a band that has been able to slide past you throughout the course of their career, I think that you would do yourself a tremendous service by digging into this band's catalog. And yes, this would probably be the first record that I would recommend diving into because it is my favorite, although I really love the album Holiday. I think that was actually a perfect record for me to buy as my first of theirs because it was a record that I liked a lot. Like I said, it was not a slow burn. It was a record that grabbed me immediately. Now, if I were to mention a couple of records that I would maybe, hold off on if you were just sort of getting interested in Magnetic Fields, I would say the first two albums, that being Distant Plastic Trees from 1991 and The Wayward Bus. Those are records I definitely like. Those are records that for me were a little bit more of a slow burn. In fact, I remember one of the records I was most excited to find because I think I bought it a little bit later on throughout the chronology of my fandom is that album, the first album, Distant Plastic Trees, because I always have a tendency to think, and I don't know why this is, because so often it's not the case, but I do have a tendency sometimes to think that a band's first or second album is going to be their best one. I would say that Distant Plastic Trees is not a bad album, but it is one that definitely, for me, took a little bit of time to grow on me. In fact, I remember the first time I listened to the first record, it was a little bit disappointing because I think at the time it was probably my least favorite record that they had released, and I remember thinking before I'd gotten it that it was just going to absolutely blow me away. The second record, also The Wayward Bus, is one that I would hold off on if you were sort of looking to get into this band. Another record that I absolutely love of theirs, one that I mentioned a second ago, is the record 69 Love Songs. If I had to pick a second favorite record in the band's catalog, that might be it, although I don't know, because Holiday is right up there too. It's also a sentimental one for me because that was the first record that I ever owned. But go out and buy this record. Own this record! If you don't own this record, that is your homework. between now and whenever it is I decide to darken your doorway again. Now, before I get out of here today, there is one sort of piece of reference material that I would very much like to recommend to you. Now, I'm assuming if you are a fan of the magnetic fields and you've made it this far into this video, this is something that won't come as news to you, but if you are somebody that is a fan of the rock documentary genre as much as I am, I would highly recommend checking out this film, Strange Powers, Stephen Merritt and the Magnetic Fields. I think that this video does a very good job sort of portraying Stephen Merritt as the person that he is. In fact, I remember the first time that I watched this movie, not knowing much about him as a person, it made perfect sense who this guy is based on the fact that I'd been listening to his music for 15 or 20 years before this video came out. During the course of this movie, he moves from New York to Los Angeles, and it sort of is his adventure as he goes along his travels. I absolutely love this movie. Stephen Merritt, as I said before, is somebody that I consider to be one of the greatest songwriters in the history of rock and roll. Much like my good friend, Mr. Stephen Patrick Morrissey, he is somebody that is an absolute wordsmith, has a little bit of a dark and uncanny sense of humor, but I think if you get it, it is something that you will appreciate. I think that might be one of the problems with people that don't like the magnetic fields, is it's just maybe something that they don't understand. It is not necessarily their luggage, but I don't think that you can make the argument, even if you aren't a fan, even if you don't understand it, even if it is not necessarily your luggage. I don't think that you could ever argue that this isn't one of the greatest bands from the 1990s. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store like Grimey's here in Music City, USA. Check back for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. Checking my notes, I think I've pretty much inarticulately covered everything that I had intended to cover today. So, unless there's anything that you'd like to add. No? All right, we're good. All right, in that case, well, I guess I will talk to you next time, my friends.